December 24, 1887, White Pine Valley, Montana Territory. Frost glittered in the moonlight as Forrest Albright reined his horse to a stop at the crest of the snow-covered ridge. At 25, he cut a striking figure against the Montana skyline, lean and athletic beneath his heavy coat, his jaw clean-shaven despite weeks on the trail. The biting winter wind stung his cheeks as he surveyed the valley below, where the scattered lights of white pine winked like fallen stars against the darkness. Home, he murmured, though the word felt hollow. The ranch that awaited him in the valley was just a place, walls and a roof, nothing more. Not since Ma died 3 winters back, taking the last warmth from the Albright homestead. Pa had followed her to the grave last spring, leaving Forrest the deed to 200 acres of Montana wilderness and a crushing solitude that seemed to grow with each passing season. He nudged his horse forward. "Come on, Ranger." Stables waiting. The truth that Forrest kept locked beneath his ribs was simple. A man survived the frontier alone because depending on others was a fool's gambit in a land that took more than it gave. He'd watched too many good men broken by loss, prospectors who gambled everything on fool's gold, families destroyed by disease or Indian raids, women widowed by the unforgiving elements. The West demanded blood payment, and Forrest had decided long ago to pay his share in solitude rather than heartbreak. The lights of White Pine grew brighter as he descended the trail. It was Christmas Eve, but Forrest felt nothing beyond mild irritation at the timing of his return. After driving a small herd to the railroad junction at Helena, he'd pushed hard through snow-choked mountain passes to make it back before the worst of winter settled in. Christmas was for families, for people with something to celebrate, for folks unlike him. The main street of White Pine was unusually busy for a winter evening. Lanterns hung from the awnings of storefronts, and Forrest could hear piano music spilling from the Golden Nugget Saloon. A group of children raced past him, laughing, their breath visible in the cold air. Forrest Albright. "You made it back," Sheriff Wilson called from the boardwalk, raising a hand in greeting. "Thought the mountain passes might have trapped you till spring." Forrest nodded, dismounting stiffly. "Nearly did. Lost a day sheltering from a blizzard in Devil's Canyon." "Well, you're just in time. The eastbound stage is due tonight if it can make it through the snow. Carrying supplies and mail folks have been waiting on for weeks." Wilson stamped his feet against the cold. "You staying in town for the Christmas gathering tomorrow?" "No," Forrest said simply. "Just need supplies, then I'm heading to the ranch." The sheriff's weathered face fell slightly. "Your choice, but no man should spend Christmas alone, son." Forrest led Ranger toward the general store, pretending not to hear. Alone was exactly how he preferred things. No disappointments that way, no one to lose. Inside Murdoch's general store, warmth from the pot-bellied stove hit him like an embrace. The shelves were picked nearly bare. Winter shipments were always unreliable in White Pine, but Forrest only needed basics to see him through until spring. He collected flour, coffee, salt pork, and ammunition, adding them to a growing pile on the counter. "Cutting it close, Mr. Albright," Edgar Murdoch said, tallying the items. "Another day, and I'd have had nothing left to sell you." "The stage bringing more supplies?" Forrest asked. "If it arrives, been delayed 3 days already on account of the snow." Murdoch wrapped Forrest's purchases in brown paper. "You know, the Christmas social at the church tomorrow." "Can't make it," Forrest interrupted, counting out coins. He was nearly finished loading his saddlebags when the distant sound of a stagecoach horn cut through the night air. A ripple of excitement moved through the townsfolk on the street. The eastbound stage meant news, mail, perhaps even holiday packages from distant relatives. Forrest paused despite himself. He rarely received mail, but there was always the slim possibility of word from his older brother Thomas, who'd left for California years ago. The stagecoach appeared at the far end of the street, its 4 horses steaming in the cold, their hooves kicking up sprays of snow. It rolled to a stop before the White Pine Hotel, and the driver immediately jumped down to check something with the undercarriage, cursing colorfully. "Broke an axle pin about 3 miles back," he announced to the gathering crowd. "Been holding it together with rope and prayers. Will need repairs before continuing to Benton." Passengers began descending from the coach. A drummer with sample cases, an elderly couple, a young man in an Eastern suit. And then, stepping carefully onto the snow-packed street, came a young woman who made Forrest freeze in place. She couldn't have been more than 22, with honey blonde hair peeking from beneath a dark blue bonnet. Her traveling dress, though rumpled from the journey, was a deep forest green that complemented her fair complexion. She stood with quiet dignity amid the chaos of unloading, glancing around at the town with wide eyes that, even from a distance, Forrest could see were a striking shade of blue. "Miss, your trunk," the driver called, and she turned quickly, extending gloved hands toward a small leather trunk. "I can manage, thank you," she said, her voice clear in the cold air. Something about her struck Forrest as out of place, not just new to White Pine, but new to the frontier itself. There was a freshness to her, an unmarked quality that the West hadn't yet had time to weather. She lifted her trunk with visible effort and made her way toward the hotel entrance. "Who's that?" Forrest found himself asking Sheriff Wilson, who'd approached to supervise the stage's arrival. "No idea. We weren't expecting new arrivals before spring." Wilson stroked his mustache thoughtfully. "Looks too young and pretty to be traveling alone to a place like this." Forrest grunted in agreement, then mentally checked himself. What did it matter to him? White Pine saw its share of travelers, fortune-seekers, and lost souls. One more wouldn't make a difference. He mounted Ranger and pointed the gelding toward the trail that would take him to the Albright ranch. The woman was already forgotten, just another face in a town he visited only when necessary. The solitary cabin waiting for him was cold and empty, but it was his, a place where expectations couldn't disappoint and attachments couldn't wound. But as he rode through the gathering darkness, the image of honey-blonde hair and a forest-green dress stayed with him, like a melody half-remembered from childhood. The Albright ranch house stood dark and silent when Forrest arrived. He led Ranger to the stable, unsaddled him, and provided fresh hay and water before trudging through the snow to the cabin. Inside, he worked mechanically, lighting the stove, unpacking supplies, melting snow for water. The routine was familiar, requiring no thought, leaving his mind free to wander. He thought of his parents, of Christmases when the cabin had been filled with warmth and laughter. His mother singing carols as she baked, his father carving small wooden animals for the boys, Thomas shouting with delight over some simple gift. Those memories belonged to another life, another Forrest, before he understood that love was just another name for future grief. As he built up the fire, he found himself thinking about the woman from the stagecoach. What business could someone like her have in White Pine? It was no place for genteel Eastern ladies, with its brutal winters and rougher men. Perhaps she was a mail-order bride, though she seemed too refined for such arrangements. A schoolteacher, maybe, though the town already had old Miss Halloway for that, not that it mattered. By spring, she'd likely be gone, driven away by the harshness of frontier life, or married off to some local rancher desperate for a wife. Forrest shook his head, annoyed with himself. Speculating about strangers wasn't like him. He was tired from the trail, that was all. He'd sleep, and by morning he'd be back to the comfortable numbness that had carried him through the last few years. But as he stretched out on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't help wondering about blue eyes and a pretty face, and what sort of Christmas gift the stagecoach had delivered to White Pine. Pearl Jacobson stood at the hotel window, watching snow fall in the lamplight. 20 years old and farther from home than she'd ever been, she felt a curious mixture of terror and exhilaration. White Pine was smaller than she'd imagined, just a main street with wooden buildings, surrounded by wilderness and mountains. Nothing like the bustling Pennsylvania town she'd left behind. The hotel room was clean but Spartan, with a narrow bed, washstand, and a small wood stove that struggled against the Montana cold. She'd paid for 2 nights, which would carry her through Christmas. After that, she would need to find more permanent arrangements, assuming anyone would claim her. Pearl pressed a hand to her coat pocket, feeling the folded letter that had brought her across the country. 3 months ago, it had arrived at her aunt's house where Pearl had been living since her parents' deaths. A brief, formal note from a man named Samuel Albright, responding to an inquiry about employment. The letter had been addressed to her father, a doctor who had once treated a Montana rancher passing through their Pennsylvania town. Apparently, her father had mentioned his daughter's skill with bookkeeping and correspondence. Now this Samuel Albright was offering a position managing accounts for his cattle operation. The letter had arrived too late. Her father and mother were already 6 months in their graves, victims of the influenza that had swept through their town. With no family left except a distant aunt who made no secret of viewing Pearl as a burden, the letter had seemed providential. Pearl had written back immediately, explaining her parents' passing and inquiring if the position might still be available for her instead. Weeks passed with no response, but winter was approaching, and her aunt's patience wearing thin. Pearl made a decision that shocked even herself. She would travel to Montana Territory and present herself in person. If the position was filled, surely a growing frontier town would have need of someone with her skills. She'd spent nearly all her small inheritance on the journey. Now here she was, in a strange town, on Christmas Eve, with no guarantee that Samuel Albright still lived, much less needed an accountant. Tomorrow, after the holiday, she would make inquiries. For tonight, she would rest and gather her courage. Pearl removed her traveling dress and changed into a nightgown, shivering in the cold room. As she brushed out her long blonde hair, she thought of the tall, solemn-faced young man she'd glimpsed as she descended from the stagecoach. He'd stood apart from the others, watching the proceedings with detached interest. Something about his posture, straight-backed yet weary, had caught her attention. He was handsome in a rugged way, with features that might have been carved from the Montana landscape itself. But it was the look in his eyes that had struck her most, a watchful loneliness that resonated with something in her own heart. Pearl shook her head at her fanciful thoughts. She hadn't come to Montana for romance but for survival. With that practical reminder, she climbed into bed, pulled the quilt to her chin, and prayed that Christmas Day would bring clarity to her uncertain future. Christmas morning dawned clear and blindingly bright, sunlight reflecting off snow-covered mountains. Forrest rose early as always, tended to the livestock, and tried to ignore the date. But as he returned to the cabin for coffee, a nagging sense of obligation tugged at him. His father would have expected better. Samuel Albright had been a firm believer in community, insisting that frontier folk needed each other to survive. "Pride is a luxury men die of out here," he often said. Forrest stared into his coffee cup. There were ranch ledgers to review, fences to check for snow damage, 100 solitary tasks to fill the day. But his father's voice persisted in his mind, along with an unwelcome image of honey-blonde hair. "Damn it all," he muttered, setting down his cup with more force than necessary. An hour later, he was riding toward town, telling himself he was only going for mail and perhaps to check if the blacksmith had received the horseshoes he'd ordered. Christmas socializing wasn't part of the plan. White pine was transformed in daylight. Evergreen boughs adorned storefronts, and children played in the snow. Most businesses were closed for the holiday, but folks milled about the street, exchanging greetings and small gifts. The church bell rang, calling people to the Christmas service. Forrest tied Ranger outside the post office, which doubled as the telegraph office. Old Jim Parker, who managed both, was just locking up. "Forrest Albright. Didn't expect to see you in town today." Jim's face creased with a smile. "Looking for mail. Nothing came for you on yesterday's stage, but I was about to head to the church service. Could check afterward if you'd like." Forrest shifted uncomfortably. "No need, just passing through." Jim studied him for a moment. "Well, if you're just passing through, you might want to know there was a young lady asking after your pa this morning." Forrest frowned. "My father's been dead since spring." "That's what I told her." She seemed mighty disappointed. Pretty little thing, Eastern by her accent, said something about correspondence and a position. A cold feeling settled in Forrest's stomach. Where is she now? "Headed to the church service with Mrs. Davis, I believe." Jim locked the post office door. "You might want to speak with her, seeing as she came all this way to meet Samuel Albright." Forrest stood frozen for a moment, then cursed under his breath. His father had always been too generous for his own good, offering help to strangers and taking in strays. It appeared he'd made some arrangement with this woman before his death, and now she'd traveled across the country for nothing. The church service was already underway when Forrest slipped through the doors at the back. The small building was crowded with nearly every resident of White Pine, all dressed in their Sunday best. He remained standing at the rear, scanning the congregation. He spotted her near the front, sitting beside Mrs. Davis, the doctor's wife. Even from behind, he recognized her by her blonde hair, neatly arranged beneath a simple blue bonnet. She wore the same green traveling dress as the night before, likely the best she had with her. The congregation rose for a hymn, and Forrest found himself staring at her profile as she sang. In daylight, she was even prettier than he'd first thought, delicate features, clear blue eyes, and a gentle expression that nonetheless suggested inner strength. She couldn't have been much over 20. The service seemed interminable. When it finally ended, people lingered, chatting and exchanging holiday wishes. Forrest remained by the door, waiting as the woman made her way through the crowd with Mrs. Davis. When she drew near, he stepped forward. "Excuse me, ma'am. I understand you were asking about Samuel Albright." She turned, startled, her blue eyes widening slightly as she recognized him from the previous evening. "Yes, I was. Do you know him?" "He was my father." Forrest removed his hat. "I'm Forrest Albright." Hope flashed across her face, quickly replaced by uncertainty. "Your father, then you must know about," she hesitated. "Forgive me, I'm Pearl Jacobson. Your father wrote to mine about a position at your ranch." "Bookkeeping and correspondence." Forrest frowned. "When was this?" "The letter arrived 3 months ago, but it was addressed to my father, who," she swallowed visibly, "my parents passed away last summer. I wrote back explaining the situation and asking if the position might still be available for me instead." Mrs. Davis, sensing a private conversation, tactfully moved away. "Miss Jacobson, my father died last spring. He couldn't have sent a letter 3 months ago." Pearl's face paled. "But I have it here." She reached into her pocket and withdrew a folded paper, handing it to Forrest with fingers that trembled slightly. The letter was indeed in his father's hand, but the date made no sense. It had been written weeks before Samuel's death, yet only sent months later. Forrest read it twice, trying to understand. "This is my father's writing," he said slowly, "but I don't recall him mentioning any position or your family." "Then you don't need an accountant." Pearl's voice was steady, but Forrest could see the effort it cost her. "I understand. I apologize for the confusion." She reached for the letter, but Forrest held it a moment longer. "You came all the way from Pennsylvania based on this." A flush of embarrassment colored her cheeks. "It seemed a good opportunity. After my parents died, there was little left for me in Harrisburg." The reality of her situation struck Forrest with sudden clarity. She had traveled alone to a frontier town in winter, based on a letter from a dead man, likely spending everything she had on the journey. And now she stood before him, holding herself with quiet dignity despite what must be crushing disappointment. "The church social is starting at the meeting hall," he said abruptly. "Would you join me? We can discuss this further over dinner." Surprise flickered across her face, followed by cautious relief. "Thank you. I would like that." As they walked toward the meeting hall, Forrest felt distinctly out of practice at conversation. "How was your journey west?" "Long and educational," Pearl replied with a small smile. "I've seen more of America in the past 3 weeks than in all my previous 20 years. 20? Forrest asked, glancing sideways at her. "You seem older." "I'll take that as a compliment to my maturity rather than my appearance," she said, a spark of humor in her eyes. Despite himself, Forrest smiled. It was meant as both. The meeting hall was festively decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons. Tables groaned under the weight of food brought by townspeople, roasted venison, ham, pies, and cakes. Children darted between adults, high on excitement and sugar. As they filled plates, Forrest felt curious eyes on them. His solitary habits were well known in White Pine, and appearing at the Christmas social with a beautiful stranger was certain to start gossip. They found seats at a corner table, where Forrest awkwardly resumed their conversation. "Do you have other family back east?" Pearl shook her head. "Only a disapproving aunt who made it clear my welcome had expired." "My parents were my world." She glanced down at her plate. "Your father's letter arrived when I most needed hope." "I'm sorry about your parents," Forrest said, feeling the inadequacy of the words. "And I'm sorry you came all this way based on a misunderstanding." "What will you do now?" he asked after a moment. Pearl met his eyes directly. "Find work. I'm well educated and capable with numbers. Surely even a frontier town needs someone who can read, write, and calculate." Her determination impressed him. Many women in her situation would have dissolved into tears or helplessness, especially on Christmas Day. "Tell me about your father," she said, changing the subject. "What kind of man writes offering a position to a stranger he met only briefly?" The question caught Forrest off guard. The kind who believed in helping others, sometimes to his own detriment. He never met a stray he wouldn't take in, animal or human. And did you inherit that quality? Pearl asked, studying him with those clear blue eyes. No, Forrest said honestly. I learned early that the frontier takes more than it gives. Attachment is a luxury most can't afford out here. That sounds lonely. It's practical, he shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. What skills did you bring to this accountant position? Pearl seemed to recognize his deflection, but allowed it. I managed my father's medical practice accounts for years. I'm skilled with ledgers, correspondence, inventory. I can read and write in both English and French, and I'm quite good with mathematics. Forrest considered this. The ranch accounts had been neglected since his father's death. He'd always meant to organize them, but found the task tedious. Perhaps, but no, taking on an employee, especially a young woman, meant responsibility. It meant letting someone into the isolated world he'd built. I'm sure White Pine could use someone with your skills, he said instead. I'll ask around town before you leave. Disappointment flickered across Pearl's face, though she quickly masked it with a polite smile. That's very kind, thank you. They finished their meal in uncomfortable silence. As they rose to leave, Sheriff Wilson approached their table. Forrest, glad you made it to town after all. He tipped his hat to Pearl. Ma'am, I don't believe we've been introduced. Pearl Jacobson, she said with a small curtsy, recently of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Sheriff Wilson, he looked between them curiously. Are you visiting family in White Pine? Actually, I came seeking employment with the Albright Ranch, Pearl explained, but I've learned that my information was outdated. The sheriff raised an eyebrow at Forrest, who stared stonily back. Well, Miss Jacobson, if you're looking for work, I know Doc Davis mentioned needing help organizing his medical records. His practice has grown since the mining camp opened north of town. Pearl's face brightened. I would be perfect for that. My father was a doctor, and I assisted with all his record-keeping. There you have it, Forrest said, relieved that a solution had presented itself so quickly. You should speak with Dr. Davis before you leave. I'll introduce you right now, the sheriff offered. He's over by the punch bowl. Pearl turned to Forrest. Thank you for the dinner and conversation, Mr. Albright. I apologize again for the confusion. No need, he said stiffly. Good luck with Dr. Davis. He watched as Sheriff Wilson led her away, telling himself he should feel only relief. The problem of Pearl Jacobson was being solved without requiring any commitment from him. She would find work with the doctor, and his life would continue unchanged. So why did he feel a hollow sensation in his chest as he watched her walk away? The sun was setting when Forrest finally left town. He'd spent the afternoon at the saloon, nursing a whiskey and avoiding conversation, yet unable to leave White Pine entirely. Something kept him tethered there, a feeling he couldn't name or didn't want to. Now, as he rode toward the ranch, the temperature was dropping rapidly. The brilliant winter sunset painted the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold, but Forrest barely noticed the beauty. His mind was preoccupied with memories of blue eyes and a quiet strength that had impressed him despite his determination to remain unaffected. He'd nearly reached the turnoff to the ranch when he noticed fresh tracks in the snow. A horse and rider had come this way recently. Few people ventured out to the Albright property, especially on Christmas Day. Alert now, Forrest followed the tracks up the long drive to the cabin. As he approached, he saw a horse tethered outside, a livery stable rental by the look of it. Smoke rose from the cabin chimney, though Forrest had banked the fire before leaving. Drawing his revolver, he dismounted quietly and approached the cabin door. Light glowed from within. He listened for voices, but heard nothing. Slowly, he pushed the door open, gun raised. Pearl Jacobson stood by the fireplace, adding wood to the stove. She looked up, startled, as the door opened. Mr. Albright, she exclaimed, dropping a log in surprise. Forrest lowered his gun, astonishment giving way to irritation. Miss Jacobson, what are you doing in my home? She straightened, brushing wood chips from her dress. I'm sorry for the intrusion. Sheriff Wilson told me you lived out this way, and I needed to speak with you. You rode out here alone, at dusk. He holstered his gun, incredulous. Do you have any idea how dangerous that was? I borrowed a horse from the livery stable. The owner gave me clear directions. Her chin lifted slightly. I can ride, Mr. Albright. I'm not completely helpless. The temperature drops 20 degrees after sunset. There are wolves in these hills. Not to mention you're trespassing on private property. Your door was unlocked, she pointed out, then had the grace to look embarrassed. Though I admit I shouldn't have entered without permission. The cold was becoming unbearable while waiting. Forrest removed his coat and hat, hanging them by the door. What was so urgent it couldn't wait until tomorrow in town? Pearl reached into her pocket and withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper. I found this at the post office. Mr. Parker was sorting the mail from yesterday's stage when I went to inquire about your father. It's addressed to you. Forrest took the package, turning it over in his hands. The address was written in his father's distinctive handwriting, but the postmark was from 3 months ago, long after Samuel's death, just like Pearl's letter. That's not possible, he muttered. Exactly what I thought when I saw it. Pearl watched him intently. The same handwriting as my letter with the same impossible timing, too significant to be coincidence. Forrest stared at the package, unsure whether to open it. Did Parker have an explanation? He said mail sometimes gets delayed for months in remote outposts, especially if the regular carrier falls ill or routes change for winter. That doesn't explain how my father wrote letters after his death. Pearl stepped closer. There's only one way to find out. Reluctantly, Forrest unwrapped the package. Inside was a small wooden box with a hinged lid, finely crafted from polished walnut. When he opened it, a folded letter lay atop a tarnished silver pocket watch. His father's watch, the one that had been buried with him. Forrest's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the letter. The handwriting was unmistakably his father's. Forrest, if you're reading this, I've passed on to be with your mother. Dr. Jacobson confirmed what I suspected. My heart is failing, and I won't see another winter. I've made arrangements for this package to be held until Christmas, as I have one final gift for you, son. You've grown strong and capable, but since your mother's passing, you've also grown hard. You believe isolation protects you from pain, but it only guarantees loneliness. I've written to Dr. Jacobson in Pennsylvania about a position at the ranch. His daughter Pearl manages his practice accounts with remarkable skill. By the time you receive this, she may have already arrived in White Pine. The watch was my father's and his father's before him. I was to be buried with it, but I've arranged for it to be retrieved. It belongs to the living, not the dead. Like the watch, you too must return to the living, my son. My final wish is that you open your heart again. Whether to Miss Jacobson or another, I cannot say, but no man is meant to face the frontier alone, with love and faith in you. Your father. Forrest stared at the letter, then at the watch, his mind struggling to make sense of it all. He planned this before he died. Pearl waited silently, giving him space to process. My father knew he was dying months before the end. Forrest's voice was hollow. He never told me. Instead, he arranged. This, he gestured vaguely between them. He arranged for his final wishes to be carried out, Pearl said gently. It seems he wanted to give you companionship even after he was gone. He had no right, Forrest said sharply, to manipulate events from beyond the grave, to bring you all this way based on. Based on what? Pearl's voice cooled. His concern for his son, his belief that I might find opportunity here. No one forced me to come to Montana, Mr. Albright. I made that choice myself. Forrest ran a hand through his hair, frustration building. You don't understand. My father always thought he knew what was best for everyone. He couldn't accept that some people prefer solitude. Do you truly? Her blue eyes searched his face. Because what I see is a man who's afraid, not one who's content. Her words struck too close to truth, igniting anger. You know nothing about me, Miss Jacobson. You've been in White Pine for one day. I know grief when I see it, she said quietly. I know what it is to build walls because loving hurts too much. The cabin fell silent except for the crackling of the fire. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling around the eaves. Finally, Pearl spoke again. It's getting dark. I should return to town. The thought of her riding alone in the gathering darkness snapped Forrest out of his anger. That's impossible. The temperature's dropping by the minute, and you don't know the trail well enough. I managed to find my way here. In daylight on a clear trail, night riding in winter is a good way to freeze to death when you miss a turn. He moved to the window, pushing aside the curtain. Snow had begun falling again, thick flakes swirling in the wind. You'll have to stay until morning. Pearl looked alarmed. That would be improper. Dying of exposure would be worse. Forrest's tone softened slightly. You can take the bed. I'll sleep by the fire. She hesitated, clearly weighing propriety against practicality. Very well, but I'll leave at first light. Forrest nodded, relief mingling with an unexpected disappointment that she was so eager to leave. Are you hungry? I can heat up some stew. Thank you, yes. The domesticity of preparing a meal together felt strange to Forrest. He wasn't accustomed to having another person in his space, moving around his kitchen, asking where things were kept. Yet there was something almost familiar about it, too, as if his body remembered motions his mind had forgotten, making space for another, considering someone else's needs. They ate in awkward silence, each lost in their own thoughts. When they finished, Pearl insisted on washing the dishes while Forrest added wood to the stove for the night. I should check on the horses, he said, reaching for his coat. May I join you? I'd like to make sure the livery horse is comfortable. Forrest nodded, surprised by the request. Most Eastern women he'd known avoided stables and the associated smells and dirt. Outside, the snow was falling steadily now, the world muffled in white. Their breath formed clouds in the lantern light as they made their way to the stable. Inside, Ranger nickered a greeting, and the livery horse, a sturdy brown mare, shifted in her stall. Pearl moved directly to the mare, speaking softly and checking her feed and water. She carried me safely. I want to make sure she's warm enough. Forrest watched as she stroked the horse's nose with genuine affection. You ride well for an Easterner. My father believed women should be capable, she said, smiling slightly. He taught me to ride, shoot, and manage accounts, all skills he said would serve me regardless of my path in life. He sounds like a wise man. He was. I think he would have liked your father, she turned to face him. What was he like, Samuel Albright? Forrest checked Ranger's water bucket, considering the question. Stubborn, opinionated, but fair and honest to a fault. He built this ranch from nothing after bringing my mother west as a young bride. When she died, something in him changed. He grew more reflective, more concerned with legacy. And your mother. Gentle but strong. She could calm the wildest horse and handle the harshest winter without complaint. Forrest smiled faintly at the memory. She made this place a home. You miss them both very much. It wasn't a question, but Forrest nodded anyway. The ranch feels empty without them. Is that why you avoid it? Sheriff Wilson mentioned you spend weeks at a time on the trail. Forrest frowned, surprised by her perception. The cattle need tending. And the memories need avoiding. Her voice was gentle without judgment. Before he could respond, a particularly strong gust of wind rattled the stable doors. The horses shifted nervously. We should get back inside, Forrest said, grateful for the interruption. Storm's getting worse. They hurried back to the cabin, the snow already ankle-deep and still falling. Inside, the warmth enveloped them like an embrace. You can take these, Forrest said, pulling a nightshirt and robe from a chest. They were my mother's, never got around to getting rid of them. Pearl accepted the clothing with a grateful smile. Thank you. She gestured toward the bedroom area, partially screened by a curtain. While she changed, Forrest arranged blankets near the stove for himself. The cabin suddenly felt too small, too intimate with her presence. He could hear the rustle of fabric as she moved, the soft pad of her stockinged feet on the wooden floor. When she emerged, his mother's nightgown and robe hung loosely on her slender frame, the sleeves slightly too long. With her hair down around her shoulders, she looked younger, more vulnerable, and impossibly beautiful. Forrest looked away quickly. You should take the bed, I'll be fine here. Pearl nodded but lingered by the table. Mr. Albright, Forrest. May I ask you something? He tensed but nodded. Do you truly believe what you said earlier, that attachment only leads to pain? Forrest stared into the fire, considering his answer. I believe that loving means eventually losing. That's the nature of life, especially on the frontier. But isn't the joy worth the pain? She asked softly. Would you erase your parents from your life to avoid the grief of losing them? The question struck him like a physical blow. Of course not. Then perhaps the love was worth the cost. Their eyes met across the cabin and something shifted in the air between them, a recognition, a possibility. Pearl broke the moment first. "Good night, Forrest, and Merry Christmas." "Merry Christmas, Pearl," he replied, the words feeling strange on his tongue after so many silent holidays. As she disappeared behind the curtain, Forrest remained by the fire, turning his father's watch over in his hands. The silver case was cool to the touch, the engraved initials of his grandfather worn smooth by decades of handling. Outside, the storm raged, but inside the cabin, something long frozen in Forrest Albright had begun, ever so slightly, to thaw. Pearl woke to the sound of quiet movement. Gray dawn light filtered through the cabin windows, illuminating Forrest as he stoked the fire. She watched him for a moment through half-closed eyes, struck by the careful way he moved, trying not to wake her. When he turned and caught her gaze, a faint flush colored his cheeks. "I didn't mean to disturb you." "You didn't," she said, sitting up. "I'm an early riser." "The storm's passed. Trail should be clear enough to get you back to town." His voice was neutral, giving away nothing of his thoughts. Pearl nodded, feeling a pang of disappointment. Part of her had hoped their conversation might have changed something between them. "I'll get dressed." After changing behind the curtain, she emerged to find coffee brewing and a simple breakfast of biscuits and preserves laid out on the table. "It's not much," Forrest said apologetically. "It's perfect." "Thank you." They ate in silence, the easy connection of the previous night seemingly vanished in the cold light of day. Pearl wondered if she had imagined the moment of understanding between them, the brief glimpse of the man beneath the armor. As they finished, Forrest cleared his throat. "I've been thinking about what my father wrote about the position." Pearl looked up, hope flaring despite her efforts to remain practical. "The ranch accounts are in disarray," he continued. "I've neglected them since Pa died. If you're still interested in employment, the offer stands." It wasn't what Pearl had hoped for, but it was something. What would the position entail? Organizing the ledgers, handling correspondence, perhaps managing supply orders. He hesitated. "It wouldn't be full-time, at least not at first. I could offer room and board plus a small wage." "Room and board here at the ranch?" Pearl asked, surprised. Forrest nodded stiffly. "In the small cabin about 100 yards from the main house. It was built for the ranch hand we used to employ. It's basic but weathertight." The arrangement made practical sense, but Pearl wasn't naive about how it would appear. "People will talk if a single woman lives on your property." "People always talk," Forrest said dismissively. "But if you're concerned about propriety, you could stay in town and ride out when needed." Pearl considered her options. The town offered safety in numbers and preservation of her reputation, but the ranch offered security and purpose, exactly what she had traveled west to find. "I would prefer the cabin," she decided. "But I would need certain assurances." Forrest raised an eyebrow, such as, "That this is a genuine employment opportunity, not charity, that my work will be valued and fairly compensated." She met his gaze directly. "And that you will treat me as a colleague, not a burden thrust upon you by your father's machinations." To her surprise, Forrest smiled, a real smile that transformed his solemn face. "Those terms are acceptable, Miss Jacobson." "When can you start?" "As soon as I retrieve my trunk from the hotel." They shook hands formally, though the touch sent a flutter through Pearl's stomach that was anything but professional. "Now," Forrest said, "we should get you back to town before anyone notices you've been gone all night." The next few weeks established a routine. Pearl moved into the small cabin, which proved comfortable once properly heated and furnished with basics from town. Each morning, she would walk to the main house where Forrest had set up a desk for her in the front room. There, she spent her days untangling years of haphazard bookkeeping, organizing correspondence, and creating systems for tracking cattle sales and purchases. Forrest was often absent, tending to winter ranch duties, but when their paths crossed, their interactions remained cordial if reserved. He seemed to appreciate her work, especially when she identified several instances where cattle buyers had underpaid, allowing him to collect the differences. As January turned to February, Pearl found herself watching for Forrest's return each day, looking forward to their brief exchanges. Sometimes he would linger, asking questions about her progress or offering small insights into ranch operations. Occasionally, he would join her for coffee in the afternoon, listening as she explained changes she'd made to the filing system or bookkeeping methods. She learned to read his moods, when he needed silence, when he was open to conversation. She discovered that beneath his stoic exterior was a thoughtful mind and dry wit that emerged in rare, unguarded moments. For his part, Forrest found himself impressed by Pearl's efficiency and intelligence. The ranch office was transformed under her care, changing from a chaotic collection of papers to an organized operation. More surprising was how quickly she adapted to frontier life, facing winter hardships without complaint and learning ranch ways with genuine interest. One evening in mid-February, a blizzard swept through the valley, howling around the cabins and piling snow against the doors. Concerned about Pearl's smaller cabin and its newer stove, Forrest trudged through the storm to check on her. He found her reading by lamplight, the cabin warm and snug. "I wanted to make sure you had enough firewood," he explained, stamping snow from his boots at the door. "That's thoughtful of you," Pearl said, marking her place in her book. "Would you like some tea? The kettle's just boiled." The invitation was innocent enough, but Forrest hesitated, aware of crossing some invisible boundary. Until now, they had maintained a careful distance despite working closely together. Entering her private space in the evening felt different from their daytime business interactions, but the storm raged outside and the cabin was warm and inviting. "Tea would be welcome, thank you." As Pearl prepared the cups, Forrest glanced around the small space. She had transformed it with small touches, a colorful quilt on the bed, a vase of dried wildflowers on the table, books stacked neatly on a shelf he'd built when she first arrived. "You've made it homey," he observed. Pearl smiled, handing him a steaming cup. "It reminds me of my parents' cottage in Pennsylvania, just smaller. We lived simply there too." "Do you miss it, the East?" She considered the question thoughtfully. "I miss certain conveniences. Fresh fruit in winter, libraries, Sunday concerts in the park." Her gaze met his. "But I've found things here I never had there, a sense of purpose, independence." "Is that enough?" Forrest asked, genuinely curious. "Many women find frontier life too harsh, too lonely." "I was lonely in Pennsylvania too, after my parents died." Pearl sipped her tea. "At least here my solitude has meaning. I'm building something." The simple honesty of her answer touched something in Forrest. Here was someone who understood the complexity of solitude, its pains and its purposes. "I've been meaning to ask," Pearl said, changing the subject. "The cattle ledgers show you usually drive a herd to market in April. Will you be hiring men to help?" "Usually, why?" "I noticed the profits from last year's drive were substantially lower than previous years. I wondered if reducing the number of hired hands might improve margins." Forrest set down his cup, surprised. "You've been studying the cattle business." "I've been studying your ranch's business," she corrected. "It's my job to understand where money comes in and goes out." "And you think we employ too many drovers?" "I think there might be more efficient arrangements." She rose and retrieved a notebook from her desk. "I've made some calculations based on herd size and distance to market." As she walked him through her analysis, Forrest found himself impressed not just by her thoroughness, but by her genuine interest in the ranch's success. She spoke of our cattle and our profits, already thinking of herself as part of the operation rather than a temporary employee. The realization stirred something in him, a longing he'd tried to suppress since his parents' deaths. The desire for partnership, for someone to share the burden and the triumphs of the life he'd chosen. "These are good suggestions," he said when she finished. "We'll implement them for the spring drive." Pearl's face brightened with pleasure. "Really?" "Really?" He stood, suddenly aware of how comfortable he'd become in her presence, how easily he could imagine more evenings like this. "I should get back before the trail is completely obscured." At the door he paused. "Thank you for the tea and the insights." "You're welcome, Forrest." She rarely used his first name, and it sounded pleasant in her voice. "Be careful in the storm." As he trudged back through the blizzard to his own cabin, Forrest realized with startling clarity that for the first time since his parents' deaths, the ranch was beginning to feel like home again. March brought the first hints of spring to White Pine Valley. Snow still blanketed the landscape, but the days grew longer, and the worst of winter's grip had loosened. With the changing season came increased activity at the Albright Ranch as preparations began for the spring cattle drive. Pearl found herself busier than ever, ordering supplies, contacting potential buyers, and organizing the financial aspects of the upcoming drive. She took pride in her expanding role, especially when Forrest began consulting her on decisions beyond mere bookkeeping. One afternoon, as they reviewed a map of the trail to the railhead, Sheriff Wilson arrived with news from town. "Telegraph came for Miss Jacobson," he announced, producing a folded paper. "Station master said it seemed important." Pearl accepted the telegram with surprise. "Thank you, Sheriff. I wasn't expecting any messages." As Wilson departed, she opened the telegram, her expression changing as she read the brief message. "Is everything all right?" Forrest asked, noting her distress. "It's from my aunt in Pennsylvania," Pearl said, her voice tight. "My cousin David is getting married and they want me to return for the wedding in May." Forrest felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. "Will you go?" "I don't know." She folded the telegram carefully. "David and I were close as children. But the journey is expensive, and May is when you'll be on the cattle drive." The unspoken question hung between them. Was her position secure enough to leave temporarily, or would returning east mean the end of her time at the Albright ranch? "You should go," Forrest said, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. "Family is important." Pearl studied his face. "Is that what you want, for me to go?" "What I want doesn't matter. It's your decision." "It matters to me," she said quietly. Forrest turned away, unable to face the question in her eyes. Over the past months, Pearl had become essential to the ranch's operation, and though he was reluctant to admit it, to his own well-being. The thought of her leaving, even temporarily, created a hollow feeling he didn't want to examine too closely. "The ranch will manage while you're away," he said finally. "Your position will be waiting when you return." "If you choose to return." Pearl's expression softened. "Thank you, Forrest, I'll think about it." That evening, alone in his cabin, Forrest poured himself a rare whiskey and contemplated the changes of the past 3 months. The ranch was running more smoothly than it had in years. The ledgers were organized, correspondence was handled promptly, and profits were increasing under Pearl's careful management. But it was more than professional competence that had altered the atmosphere of the place. It was Pearl herself, her quiet strength, her intelligent conversation, her occasional laughter that seemed to brighten even the darkest winter days. Forrest removed his father's pocket watch from his vest, opening the case to check the time. The soft ticking had become a comforting presence, a connection to his father that felt supportive rather than painful. "You were right, Pa," he murmured to the empty room, "but I'm still not sure I can do this." The prospect of Pearl returning east awakened fears he'd tried to bury. What if she realized the comforts of civilization outweighed the harsh beauty of Montana? What if family ties proved stronger than whatever tenuous connection had formed between them? What if opening his heart meant only preparing for another loss? The whiskey provided no answers, only a warm numbness that eventually carried him to sleep. Pearl spent a restless night considering her options. The telegram from her aunt had been unexpected. She hadn't written to inform them of her whereabouts after arriving in Montana, partly from pride and partly from fear they would demand her return. Now the invitation to David's wedding presented a dilemma. She had found purpose and independence at the Albright Ranch, something she'd never experienced in Pennsylvania. Yet family ties were not easily severed, and David had been like a brother to her before their paths diverged. More complicated were her feelings for Forrest. Over the winter months, she had come to admire his quiet strength, his dedication to the ranch, and the gentle consideration he showed despite his attempts to maintain emotional distance. She hoped that he felt something for her as well, though he guarded his heart carefully. Would leaving, even temporarily, damage the fragile connection growing between them, or might absence clarify what they meant to each other? By morning, she had made her decision. She would attend the wedding but return immediately after. Montana was her home now, and the Albright Ranch was where she belonged. When she informed Forrest of her plans, his expression revealed little, but she noticed a tightness around his eyes that suggested relief mingled with concern. "I'll only be gone 3 weeks," she assured him. "Back well before the summer heat sets in." "The ranch will be here when you return," he said, his tone carefully neutral. Pearl hesitated, then spoke from the heart. "I've found something here I never expected, Forrest. Not just employment, but a place where I belong. I don't take that lightly. For a moment the mask slipped, and she glimpsed vulnerability in his eyes. Safe travels, Pearl. We'll await your return. It was a small thing, but it carried weight. The day of Pearl's departure arrived with unexpected swiftness. April's tentative warmth had melted most of the snow, leaving the valley green and vibrant. Forrest drove her to town in the wagon, her small trunk loaded in the back. The eastbound stage was already waiting when they arrived in White Pine. Several other passengers milled about, preparing for the journey. As the driver loaded Pearl's trunk, an awkward silence fell between her and Forrest. There was so much unsaid, so many feelings neither had found the courage to express. "I've left everything organized in the office," Pearl said finally. "The ledgers are current, and I've prepared letters for the cattle buyers that just need your signature." "Thank you," Forrest shifted uncomfortably. "I'm sure everything will be fine." "All aboard who's coming aboard," the driver called. "Eastbound stage leaving in 5 minutes." Pearl gathered her courage. "Forrest, You should take this," he interrupted, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small leather pouch and pressed it into her hand. "For the journey." Inside, Pearl found a delicate silver locket on a chain. When opened, it contained a tiny pressed wildflower, a Montana bluebell. "It was my mother's," Forrest explained, his voice rough. "She always said it reminded her of home, no matter how far she traveled." Pearl's eyes filled with tears. "It's beautiful, thank you." "Last call for the eastbound stage," the driver shouted. Impulsively, Pearl rose on tiptoes and pressed a kiss to Forrest's cheek. "I'll return, I promise." Before he could respond, she hurried to the stagecoach and climbed aboard. As the stage pulled away, she looked back to see Forrest standing in the street, one hand raised in farewell, the other pressed to his cheek where she had kissed him. The following weeks were the longest of Forrest's life. Spring arrived in full force, bringing the usual ranch activities, calving season, fence repairs, preparations for the cattle drive. He performed these tasks mechanically, his thoughts constantly straying to Pearl. The ranch house felt emptier than ever without her presence. He found himself stopping by her desk, looking at her neat handwriting in the ledgers, missing the sound of her voice as she explained some new organizational system she'd devised. In town for supplies, he overheard gossip that only increased his anxiety. "Hear about that Eastern gal working for Albright?" one miner asked another at the general store. "Went back east for a family wedding." "Bet she won't return, why would she? Pretty girl like that could have her pick of proper suitors back in civilization." "Shame," his companion replied. Albright's place was finally starting to look respectable with a woman's touch. Forrest left without his purchases, unable to bear more speculation about Pearl's return or lack thereof. The fear that had haunted him since she left now seemed increasingly justified. Why would she return to the hardships of frontier life when the East offered comfort and society? The scheduled day of Pearl's return came and went with no sign of her. Forrest told himself the stage was delayed, common enough in spring when rain turned mountain passes to mud. But as one day stretched to 3, then 5, doubt gnawed at him. Had she decided to stay in Pennsylvania after all? Had the comforts of civilization reminded her of all she'd sacrificed to come west? Or worse, had something happened to her on the dangerous journey? On the 6th day after her expected return, Sheriff Wilson rode out to the ranch. "Got a telegram from Bozeman," he said without preamble. "Stagecoach was delayed by a washout on the mountain road. Should arrive tomorrow if the weather holds." Relief washed over Forrest, followed quickly by embarrassment at his visible reaction. "Thank you for letting me know." Wilson studied him with knowing eyes. "You know, Forrest, your father would be mighty pleased to see how things have worked out." "Nothing's worked out yet," Forrest replied tersely. "Hasn't it?" The sheriff smiled slightly. "Never seen the Albright place looking so prosperous, or you looking so invested in something beyond cattle." After Wilson left, Forrest found himself filled with restless energy. He spent the afternoon cleaning the main house, airing out rooms that had been closed for months, even picking wildflowers to place on Pearl's desk. He told himself it was merely courtesy, a welcome for a valued employee. But as evening fell, he faced the truth he'd been avoiding. He was in love with Pearl Jacobson. The realization should have terrified him. Love meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant pain. But instead, he felt a strange sense of calm, as if acknowledging the truth had lifted a weight he'd carried for too long. Tomorrow, he would ride into town to meet the stage. And if when Pearl returned, he would find the courage to tell her how he felt. Pearl's journey back to Montana was an exercise in patience. Delays plagued the stagecoach, washouts from spring rains, a broken wheel, even a brief holdup by road agents that thankfully resulted in no injuries, only the loss of the mail pouch. Each setback tested her resolve, but Pearl's determination never wavered. Her visit east had confirmed what she already knew. Her future lay in Montana, specifically at the Albright Ranch. The wedding had been lovely, her family welcoming, but Pennsylvania no longer felt like home. Home was a small cabin near a rugged ranch house. Home was ledgers and correspondence and the satisfaction of building something meaningful. Home, though she scarcely dared admit it even to herself, was wherever Forrest Albright was. As the stagecoach finally approached White Pine, Pearl's heart raced with anticipation. Would Forrest be waiting? Had he missed her as she had missed him? The silver locket he'd given her lay warm against her skin, a constant reminder of the connection she hoped they shared. The stage rounded the final bend, and White Pine came into view, nestled in its valley. Pearl leaned forward, searching the small crowd gathered to meet the coach. And then she saw him, tall and straight-backed, standing slightly apart from the others, his eyes fixed on the approaching stage. When the coach finally stopped, Pearl barely waited for the driver to open the door before descending. For a moment, she and Forrest simply looked at each other across the dusty street, neither moving. Then, with a decisiveness that surprised her, Forrest crossed the distance between them in long strides. Before Pearl could speak, he took her hands in his. "I thought you might not return," he said, his voice low and rough with emotion. "I promised I would," Pearl replied, searching his face. "This is where I belong." Around them, townsfolk watched with undisguised interest, but Forrest seemed oblivious to their audience. "Pearl, I need to tell you something. These weeks without you." "Miss Jacobson," Dr. Davis called, approaching from the boardwalk. "Welcome back. I was hoping to speak with you about assisting with my records as we discussed before your departure." Pearl glanced at the doctor, then back at Forrest, whose expression had closed again, the moment lost. "Thank you, doctor," she said politely. "Perhaps we could discuss it another time. I've just arrived." Of course. Drop by the office tomorrow if you have time." The doctor tipped his hat and moved away. An awkward silence fell between Pearl and Forrest. Whatever he had been about to say seemed to have retreated behind his usual reserve. "Your trunk?" he asked finally, gesturing to the stagecoach. "Yes, thank you." Pearl tried to hide her disappointment as the moment of connection slipped away. As they loaded her trunk into Forrest's wagon, casual conversation replaced the intensity of their initial reunion. The weather, ranch happenings, her journey, safe topics that required no emotional risk, but as they drove out of town toward the ranch, Pearl gathered her courage. "Forrest, what were you going to say before Doctor?" Davis interrupted. He kept his eyes on the road, his hands tight on the reins. "It wasn't important." "It seemed important." She touched the locket at her throat. "Important enough that you came to meet the stage." Forrest glanced at her then, his expression softening at the sight of his mother's locket around her neck. "I missed you," he said finally, "more than I expected, more than makes sense for an employer missing an employee." Pearl's heart quickened. "Perhaps that's because I'm more than just an employee to you, as you are more than just an employer to me." The wagon crested a small rise, and the Albright Ranch came into view in the valley below. The main house, the barn, and Pearl's small cabin beside it. Forrest reined the horses to a stop, turning to face her fully. "When you didn't return on schedule, I thought," he broke off, struggling for words. "I thought I'd lost another person he couldn't finish." "Another person you care about," Pearl suggested gently. "Another person I love," he said, the words finally breaking free. "I love you, Pearl. I think I have since Christmas, though I was too stubborn to admit it." Joy bubbled up inside her. "I love you too, Forrest. I think I started falling the moment I found your father's package, when I saw the man beneath the armor." Forrest's hand reached up to touch her cheek. "I've been alone so long, I forgot how to be anything else. But these months with you, you've reminded me what it means to share a life, not just endure it." "Then share it with me," Pearl said, covering his hand with her own. "Not as employer and employee, but as partners, in the ranch and in life." Instead of answering with words, Forrest leaned forward and kissed her, gently at first, then with growing confidence as Pearl responded eagerly. When they finally parted, both were smiling. "Is that a yes?" Pearl asked, slightly breathless. "It's a yes," Forrest confirmed, his smile wider than she'd ever seen, "though we should probably make it official. Pearl Jacobson, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. 1,000 times yes. They sealed the promise with another kiss, then continued down the hill toward home, their home, as the setting sun painted the Montana sky in shades of gold and promise. 3 months later, on a perfect summer day, Pearl and Forrest were married in the White Pine Church. The whole town turned out for the celebration, delighted by the romance that had bloomed from Samuel Albright's final matchmaking effort. Sheriff Wilson served as best man, and Dr. Davis gave the bride away. Pearl wore a simple white dress with Samuel Albright's pocket watch chain wrapped around her bouquet, something old to complement the new beginning. After the ceremony, the couple stood greeting well-wishers outside the church. As the crowd thinned, Forrest drew Pearl slightly aside. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Another gift," Pearl smiled. "You've already given me so much. This one is special. I found it in my father's desk after you left for Pennsylvania. It was labeled for Pearl Christmas gift." Puzzled, Pearl unwrapped the package. Inside was a small, hand-carved wooden box. When she opened it, she found a delicate silver key on a ribbon. "A key?" she asked, looking up at Forrest in confusion. "To the ranch house," he explained. "My father had it made before he died. The note inside said it was to be a Christmas gift for the woman who would bring his son back to life." Forrest's voice roughened with emotion. "Somehow, he knew you would be that woman." Tears filled Pearl's eyes. "He gave us both gifts that Christmas, didn't he? You found your way back to living, and I found my home." "Our home," Forrest corrected, slipping his arm around her waist. "Just as he planned." As they walked toward the waiting wagon that would take them back to the Albright Ranch, their ranch now, Pearl thought about the strange sequence of events that had brought her to this moment. A letter arriving months after its writer's death, a stagecoach arrival on Christmas Eve, a gift with a name that changed 2 lives forever. Some might call it coincidence, others fate. But as Forrest helped her into the wagon and took his place beside her, Pearl decided it was simply love, the kind that transcends time and distance, that finds a way even after death, that transforms isolation into family. The kind of love that turns a frontier into home.